Konnichiwa Mina, and after the long delay, here is Week 9 of the 2017 PFA season, the week of October 15th through 16th. But before we begin, of course, let's take a look at the standings after Week 8. In the National East, Cleveland has a 2.5 game lead over Manhattan, and Omaha has the 3.5 game lead over Indianapolis in the National Central. Jacksonville has the 1 game lead over Birmingham in the National South. Oakland has the tiebreaker over Portland in the National West. Cincinnati has the half game lead over Columbus, Pittsburgh in the Century East. Chicago has the tiebreaker over Oklahoma in the Century Central. Miami has the half a game lead over Dallas in the Century South. And San Francisco has a half game lead over Las Vegas in the Century West. Cleveland, Jacksonville, Oklahoma, Chicago, and Miami still remain undefeated, and Milwaukee remains the last winless team. And then, of course, here's the schedule for Week 9 this week. We're going to start off with Tampa going to Atlanta. Then an interesting showdown still, Miami going to Baltimore, between a matchup between the two teams that we think would be playing the Century Conference Championship game, but Baltimore needs to pick up the pace if they want to be able to do that. Denver going to Boston. New Orleans going to Houston, Omaha going to Indianapolis. That's like Indianapolis, Omaha's last challenge in the National Central looks like at the moment. Phoenix going to Kansas City, 2 4-3 teams are going to go at. Columbus going to Louisville, that'll be interesting against the two worst teams last year that have already looked better. Buffalo going to Philadelphia. Then we go to the 4 p.m. games with Pittsburgh going to Cincinnati. Whoever wins that will have the lead in the Century East. Orlando going to El Paso, 2 matches between 2 solid teams that are fighting for a playoff spot at the moment. Milwaukee going to Hawaii. Dallas going to Las Vegas, a matchup between 2 wild card teams pretty much at the moment. Birmingham going to Los Angeles. Oakland going to Portland. San Diego going to San Francisco. Cleveland going to Seattle, that's going to be interesting. Manhattan going to Washington, that's very interesting for the National East. And then we get to the huge Sunday night game between the 2 undefeated teams. Jacksonville going to Oklahoma, and on Monday night we get our huge arch rivalry in the PFA as Chicago visits Minneapolis. So let's get to Week 9. So our first game begins down in Atlanta as it's Tampa visiting Atlanta in their division showdown. These two played each other early on in the year where Tampa got their first ever win against Atlanta. Both are 2-5, trying to keep ahead in their tie with San Antonio at the moment in the bottom half of the National South as they're trying to somehow catch up with everyone in the playoff spot. And Atlanta would dominate 40-6 to go up to 3-5 as Tampa's now lost 4 in a row. Atlanta's quarterback Cody Perry was awesome, 12 of 17 for 274 yards and 3 touchdowns. And their running back Kenneth Dixon had 17 carries for 100 yards. Their wide receiver Christopher Eaton 3 receptions, 117 yards and 2 touchdowns. Atlanta's defensive tackle William Phillips had 10 tackles and 2 sacks. And Tampa's linebacker Philip Paul had 12 tackles and 2 sacks. And this is the 6th most lopsided game in NFL history with a 34-point difference. So Atlanta needed this win badly, and that's going to be a tough pill to swallow for Tampa on the flight back home to Tampa. Then we go up to Baltimore for the big showdown, or at least we thought it was going to be, as it's Miami visiting Baltimore, as Miami still remains undefeated, but Baltimore is trying to recover from their terrible start. They won last week. They need to continue on if they want to have any shot at making the playoffs and challenging everyone else in the Century East, which is so wide open so far at the moment. And Baltimore would give Miami their first loss of the season as they win 24-14 as Baltimore's quarterback Andrew Lassiter was 27 of 39 for 257 yards and 3 touchdowns. He had his best game so far this year, as Miami's quarterback Anthony McCormick did not really do so good. Miami's wide receiver Edward Miller, on the other hand, had a really good day. 6 receptions, 131 yards and 2 touchdowns. And Baltimore's defense was really good today as their linebacker Curtis Dick had 10 tackles, and Juan Pike, their strong safety, had 6 tackles, a sack, and 2 forced fumbles. And this loss ends Miami's 11-game winning streak, which was the 3rd longest in PFA history, as still remains Omaha and Birmingham as the longest win streaks in the league. That's a tough loss for Miami, but they're still in the top spot in the Century South and still in the top spot for buys in the Century Conference. Then we go up more north to Foxborough as it's Denver visiting Boston. Boston got their first win last week of the season as Denver lost 2 in a row now and definitely not looking good, as Denver was another favorite to make it to the conference championship in PFA Bowl 2. They need to turn the season around immediately. And Denver would dominate as they win 31-10 to get themselves right back on track as Boston continues to have a terrible season. And there was no real offense in this game. It was pretty much all defense as Boston's defensive end Ralph Schwitz had 12 tackles, 2 sacks, a forced fumble, and a fumble recovery. And their linebacker Daniel Spinks had 11 tackles and a forced fumble. Hard to believe that Denver had such a blowout victory, but none of their teammates whatsoever got mentioned. Hey, that's just what happened. No one really had any really good stats across the board. It was just an unbelievable Denver blowout. Then we go down south to Houston as we got a division showdown in the Century South as New Orleans visits Houston. New Orleans beat Houston earlier this year. Let's see what happens in their rematch. Houston's defense would do all the work as they win 24-7. However, both teams suffer a huge price as Houston's quarterback Stephen Hargrove is going to miss the next 1 to 2 weeks with a broken cheekbone. And New Orleans is going to miss their backup quarterback Philip Ainsworth for the next 2 to 4 weeks with a torn bicep muscle. And of course, the third string, Gustavo Davis, had to fill in, and he was terrible. 11 of 22 for 97 yards, no touchdowns, and 2 picks. As Houston's wide receiver Joseph Boland had 32 carries, 114 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And New Orleans linebacker Keith Garcia had 15 tackles and 5 sacks, which is the 4th most sacks in a single game. Yep, New Orleans is definitely struggling. They lost James Williams. He's still doubtful for next week, so it looks like we're going to have to stick with Gustavo next week, unless they have a bye. And they've lost Jeremy Cornell, they're one of the other very good linebackers, so they're in trouble this season. Their season has been off to a terrible start, a lot of it due to injuries. As Houston got a needed victory, but at what price, losing Stephen Hargrove, even though he himself has not been doing that good. Then we go up north to Indianapolis as Omaha visits Indianapolis, a national central showdown, as Omaha trying to maintain their huge lead against everyone in that division, as Indianapolis has other plans as they're trying to get over 500 and be within a 3-game deficit behind Omaha. Omaha would win in a defensive struggle 13-9, however it would be a huge price to pay as Omaha's quarterback Archie Marvin was knocked out of the game and is going to miss the next 2 weeks with a broken cheekbone just like Stephen Hargrove. That's going to suck as they've never lost him before. And to make matters worse, his backup quarterback was also knocked out of the game and is not going to be playing next week with a broken finger, so now they're on their 3rd string quarterback. Oh my god, that's definitely not a good sign, as this team is nowhere near as dominant offensively as they were last year. And 5 sacks by Indianapolis' defense, so they got a lot of pressure. And Omaha felt it when they lost their 2 quarterbacks. So Omaha's going to be in trouble in the next 2 weeks as they're still, believe it or not, just 3rd place in the National Conference playoff picture. So we'll see what happens in the next few weeks. After that, we go out to Arrowhead in Kansas City as Phoenix visits Kansas City, the first time these 2 teams have ever met each other. And both of them are trying to get their season right and trying to get to 5-3. As both are fighting very hard competition in their respective conferences and divisions. And Kansas City's defense would overwhelm Phoenix and win 16-6 as they go to 5-3, and Phoenix struggles along at 4-4. Who would have thought this would be happening? Phoenix's running back David Sexton, 19 carries, 113 yards, and their strong safety Frank John, 12 tackles and 2 sacks, and their linebacker Aaron Stokes, 11 tackles and 1 sack. And Kansas City defensive end Onis Linder, 13 tackles and 2 sacks. An impressive victory for Kansas City after their rocky start in the year, but difficult loss for Phoenix to swallow, especially since Hawaii and Oakland are pounding on the door right behind them. Then we go up north to Louisville as it's Columbus visiting Louisville as Columbus comes in with their best win streak ever at 3 wins, 1 game behind 500 for the first time ever. And Louisville, although they're 2-5, they're playing a lot better than people would expect. Their defense is playing really solid. Their offense, although it has its unfortunate bad moments, they have some solid play behind Stanford Fink. And Louisville will win 20-17 as Albert Hendrick, Columbus's quarterback, was knocked out of the game after he was put up a solid showing, and his backup once again continued to struggle as Louisville's first-round pick, their number 1 overall pick, remember, Stanford Fink, was 24-30, 355 yards, probably the most ever in Louisville history, 1 touchdown and a pick. Their wide receiver, Scott Bueno, had 6 receptions for 100 yards. Their linebacker, Larry Mercier, had 12 tackles and a sack, and Columbus strong safety, James Hewitt, had 10 tackles. So a very impressive victory for Louisville as they moved to 3-5 and overall improved from last year. Then we go up north to Philadelphia as the Philadelphia Hawks host the Buffalo Sabres, the first time these two teams are ever playing against each other. In a rainy Philadelphia day, as Philadelphia is trying to end their losing streak after that embarrassing loss to Boston last week, which is their only victory so far, as Buffalo is trying to continue their rebound from their terrible start to the season too. And Buffalo would get the upset 26-13 as Philadelphia's offense continues to struggle without Leroy Black. Buffalo's quarterback Ricky Bale, 22 of 33 for 238 yards, a touchdown and a pick. Their cornerback Wayne Lunsford had 3 tackles, and an 89-yard punt return for a touchdown, which helps kickstart their game, as Philadelphia's linebacker Rick Lopez had 11 tackles and 2 sacks. Another disappointing loss for Philadelphia, as they now lost 4 in a row as Buffalo rebounds at 3-5. They're still in contention in the Century East. And with that, that was all the 1 p.m. games as we go over to Cincinnati for the first 4 p.m. game, as it's Pittsburgh visiting Cincinnati with the lead in the Century East on the line, as Gerald Putman continues his solid performance as Pittsburgh's quarterback, as Cincinnati's now lost 2 in a row and they need to keep up to maintain their lead in the Century East. And Pittsburgh would get the needed victory 12-10 in a defensive struggle, as neither quarterback did necessarily that impressive, as Pittsburgh's wide receiver Gary Berry had 5 receptions and 102 yards. Since Pittsburgh's defensive end Charlie Weber had 6 tackles and 3 sacks too, they continue his strong season, and Cincinnati's linebacker Adolph Lewis had 11 tackles. And with that victory, Pittsburgh now takes over as the leader in the Century East, as Cincinnati's now lost 3 in a row. Then we go down to El Paso for a very important Century Conference wildcard showdown, as Orlando visits El Paso in a huge thunderstorm that's going across the Mexico border. As we get to look at the stats of the game now, El Paso would dominate as they lead 31-0 at one point to win 31-14 in the rain, as they now won 4 in a row, and Orlando's now lost 4 in a row, as El Paso's quarterback James Stepanovic 16 of 23 for 217 yards and 3 touchdowns. Quarterback Milton Hester, his first return back in Orlando after a couple weeks of injury, was 26 of 42, 222 yards, 2 touchdowns, but 4 costly picks. As the running back Frank Evans had 22 carries, 131 yards, 5 receptions, 39 yards, and a touchdown. El Paso's wide receiver Alfred Phipps had 6 receptions, 127 yards, and a touchdown. And Orlando linebacker James Lyons had 13 tackles and a sack, and El Paso linebacker Albert Corwin had 12 tackles. A very dominant, impressive victory for El Paso, a very difficult loss for Orlando after they got back their quarterback. So, man, so much for that incredible start to the year as Orlando continues to struggle. Then we go all the way out to Hawaii in Honolulu as the Hawaii Phantoms host the Milwaukee Lakers in a rematch from Week 1 of the year, where Milwaukee began their terrible start to the season as they still remain winless, and Hawaii's trying to recover from their 2-game losses in a row now as they're trying to keep up with Phoenix and challenge Oakland in this National West. And Honolulu would win 23-14 as they had a 14-0 deficit going into the second half almost. As Milwaukee continues the 3rd longest losing drought in league history now, as their quarterback Stephen Vincent, who is their 3rd string quarterback, was not really that impressive this week around. Neither was Hawaii's quarterback Richard Clough. Meanwhile, Milwaukee's running back Steven Salisbury had 14 carries, 106 yards, and a touchdown. Wide receiver for Hawaii Eric Fay had 5 receptions, 109 yards, and a touchdown. Milwaukee's linebacker Richard Herron had 11 tackles and 2 sacks. Hawaii's linebacker Wilson Sharp continues to impress with 13 tackles and 1 sack. So a surprisingly hard-fought victory for Hawaii as they're back to 500, keep time with Phoenix in a Century National West's 2nd seed behind Oakland, as Milwaukee continues their disappointing season halfway there to 0-18 possibly. Then we move back to the continental U.S. out in Las Vegas as the Stars visit the Gamblers in an important matchup in the Century Conference playoff picture, as both are fighting for a wildcard spot, and of course both of them are still fighting to get the division title in their respective divisions. Dallas would dominate Las Vegas as they would win 30-21 as they had a 24-0 lead, I think, at one point, as Dallas quarterback Troy Hill was 19 of 29 for 241 yards and a touchdown. Keith Belcher, finally, their quarterback for Las Vegas, finally returned after his injury, was 28 of 43, 375 yards, 3 touchdowns and a pick. Las Vegas running back John Maxwell had 6 receptions, 140 yards and 2 touchdowns. Dallas linebacker Victor Shores continues to impress this year, 12 tackles. And the free safety Richard Thatcher had 12 tackles. And Las Vegas strong safety Chris Dallas had 11 tackles. So, a very impressive victory for Dallas, as now they have won 3 in a row and have easily secured right now the 6th spot in the Century Conference wildcard picture, as Las Vegas falls back to 4-3, tying with Seattle and El Paso at the moment, as San Francisco has the main lead in the Century West. Then we go out to Los Angeles as the Birmingham Hornets visit the Los Angeles Angels, as Los Angeles continues their impressive season after that hard-fought Sunday night game against Atlanta last week. And Los Angeles got their 2nd win last week, but is trying to recover from their terrible start to the year. Birmingham would win as 27-7, which is the exact same score that Birmingham won last time earlier this year when they played Los Angeles. Birmingham's quarterback Ollie Burke was 25 of 36, 274 yards, 2 touchdowns and a pick. And then running back Guy Metz had 25 carries for 106 yards. And Los Angeles' defense also was stingy today, as the strong safety Daniel Stewart had 15 tackles and a sack, and their linebacker Julius Searcy had 10 tackles and a sack. So thankfully for Birmingham, their sack and sting defense was just as impressive even without Christopher Vella, their star linebacker for this game, who missed it and might miss next week too due to his injury. As Birmingham continues to go along with this dominant season, if they could just get past Jacksonville, they could be a major threat in the playoffs. Then we go up to the Pacific Northwest as Oakland visits Portland in a National West showdown, as Oakland, now with the lead in the National West at the moment, needs to win this to maintain their 1-game lead over Hawaii and Phoenix, as Portland's trying to recover from their very terrible start to the season. Oakland would get the victory 27-13 as they improved to 5-3 to match their win total from last year, as Ruben Williams, their quarterback, looked awesome today. 14 of 23, 302 yards and 3 touchdowns. Portland's running back Manuel Franklin had 30 carries for 109 yards. And Oakland's wide receiver Joshua Crane had just 2 receptions, but 140 yards and 2 touchdowns, as he got a bomb of 62 and 78 yards that went for a touchdown. And Oakland's strong safety Willis Little had 15 tackles. So very impressive victory to Oakland to match their win total from last year and take the lead in the National West, as Portland continues to struggle. Then we go down south to Santa Clara as the lowly San Diego Rays visits the hot, strong San Francisco Union, as they're trying to maintain their strong lead now in the Century West, thanks to Las Vegas is losing today, as Seattle is going to have to play Cleveland later. And San Diego's trying to recover from the terrible start to the season, with Ronaldo Schneider now as their quarterback for the remaining probably future of the season. And San Diego would dominate as they win 21-6 to a chorus of boos from San Francisco's crowd, as they were booing their team for their terrible offensive performance, as San Diego's quarterback Ronaldo Schneider was 13 of 21 for 266 yards, 3 touchdowns and a pick. And their wide receiver Thomas Casey, 3 receptions, 110 yards and a touchdown. And their linebacker Aaron Silvers, 11 tackles and 2 sacks. And their strong safety James Stanley, 11 tackles. San Francisco's defensive end Charles Magnuson, it was the only bright spot for the game, as he was 11 tackles and 2 sacks. And with that, he would officially have 26 sacks, which would take over Alfred Helms' record of Chicago last year of 26 sacks, which is the most sacks in a season. So congratulations for him. With still over half the season left, he already has the sack record for a season. How high will that sack total be at the end of the year is amazing question to figure out. But in the end, a very difficult loss for San Francisco to hold, as Seattle still could possibly tie them later on today. Speaking of Seattle, that's our next game, as the undefeated Cleveland Bulldogs visit the Seattle Quakes in the same cold front storm that happened with Oakland and Portland just now too, as Cleveland's trying to maintain their lead and get the one-up over Jacksonville at the moment. They got to play Sunday night in a bit. And Seattle's trying to tie San Francisco for the lead in the Century West. In a wild back-and-forth game, Cleveland would get it in overtime, 30-24, as they had a 24-7 lead going into the second half, and Seattle scored 17 unanswered points, including a 56-yard bomb to tie the game up with just 56 seconds remaining. However, it was not enough in the end as Cleveland would get it. Cleveland's quarterback Scott Hernandez was 27 of 43 for 335 yards, 2 touchdowns and a pick. Seattle's quarterback Josh Tucker actually outplayed him, 20 of 35 for 292 yards and 3 touchdowns. Cleveland's wide receiver Gerald Todd, 5 receptions, 143 yards and a touchdown. Seattle's wide receiver Eric Benjamin had 4 receptions, 139 yards and a touchdown, and Seattle linebacker Melvin Jones had 12 tackles and 2 sacks. So what an incredible game that was, but in the end for Seattle it just was not enough, as Cleveland will stay undefeated and match their win total from last year. Then we go out back to Washington, as it's the Manhattan Greens visiting the Washington Americans in a pretty crucial National East showdown, as whoever wins this game will be second place behind the undefeated Cleveland Bulldogs, as Manhattan lost 3 in a row. Washington's been struggling, but hanging on in there as they're going to match up against each other now. And Manhattan would shut out Washington 16-0 on the road, believe it or not, as they improved to 5-3 and officially have their best season ever. As Washington, oh my god, their offense couldn't get anything going against surprisingly a strong defense showing by Manhattan today, as New York's quarterback Jamie Norwood was 19 of 27 for 182 yards and a touchdown. Washington's linebacker Joshua Leva had 12 tackles, and their defensive end Ira Washington had 11 tackles and a sack. Their defense did a job, but their offense just would not show up again, as the offense continues to struggle this year, and it's cost them badly, as they're now 4-4 and in trouble of missing the playoffs to a chorus of boos, just like what happened in San Francisco today as well. And then, oh boy, it came down to this. The biggest showdown probably in PFA history at the moment, one of the highest viewed games ever at this moment, as it's the undefeated Jacksonville Bucks visiting the undefeated Oklahoma Oilers, as both teams are trying to fight to maintain their undefeated streak and keep up with, in Jacksonville's case, Birmingham in the National South, and Oklahoma's case, Chicago, Detroit, and Kansas City in the Century Central. This is a very important game for both teams on this Sunday night. Who would have thought this would happen? And Jacksonville would dominate as they win 44-33 in the 5th highest scoring game in PFA history, with 77 points scored, as they remain undefeated, as Jacksonville's quarterback Michael Witters was 18 of 22, 381 yards and 2 touchdowns. However, Oklahoma's quarterback Wiley Chester, who's filled in for the injured Peter Rose, was 18 of 29, 351 yards, 2 touchdowns, but 2 pick sixes that honestly decided the game for outcome, as that made the difference in the score. And 4 100-yard receivers in this game, 3 of them from Oklahoma, as Jacksonville's David Stock had 11 tackles and a pick 6, and Jacksonville's linebacker Richard Calabrese had 10 tackles, a sack, and the other pick 6. So what an impressive showing by Jacksonville as they move to 8-0. What a difficult loss that's going to take for Oklahoma suffering the next week, as they got to play Chicago next week, who now has the #1 spot in the Century Central Comp Division. And Oklahoma badly needs to get back Peter Rose and their starting running back Ricky Roller, and get back on some of their defensive players that they're missing due to injury. And then we finish off the week with a very big Monday night game, as Chicago visits Minneapolis in a Century Central showdown between the biggest arch rivals in the league. There's going to be a lot of beating down against each other this game. It's going to be like the Steelers and Bengals. There's probably going to be a lot of penalties and a lot of fights in this game, as the Minneapolis crowd is going to go nuts, as they actually broke the sound record in the middle of this game too. And for the first time ever in PFA history, we had a tie, as they couldn't get anything going offensively at all in the game, except for Chicago at the very beginning of the game, where they had a 17-3 lead. However, Chicago quarterback Matthew Smart was knocked out of the game with a broken finger on a very hard-ass hit that Minneapolis delivered, and his backup quarterback could not get anything going. Minneapolis made the comeback, but it wasn't enough, as they went to overtime, and they couldn't get anywhere close to even getting a field goal, which neither of them attempted at all in overtime, so no one scored whatsoever. As Minneapolis' running back Gary Snyder was 36 carries, 132 yards and a touchdown. Chicago's wide receiver Raymond Hughes had 6 receptions, 104 yards. San Francisco's defensive end Alfred Helms had 22 tackles, 2 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and a fumble recovery, and at 22 tackles is the most tackles in a game. And Minneapolis' linebacker Eric Witt had 11 tackles, a sack, and a pick, as Minneapolis did everything they could defensively to pull out their victory, but their offense just could not get anything going. And of course, thankfully for them, Chicago, losing Matthew Smart for the game, saved their chances to possibly get a tie instead of a loss. As Minneapolis continues to boo Samuel Clark, their starting quarterback, and they're desperately calling for their backup first-round pick to finally get a start after this very hard pill to swallow, as they tied Chicago instead of beating them, which they felt like they could. But hey, that ended Chicago's undefeated streak as well. And with that, week 8-9 was over. As we look at the standings now, in the National East, Cleveland leads Manhattan by 2.5 games. And then Omaha leads Denver by 4 games. In the National Central, Jacksonville still maintains their 1-game lead over Birmingham in the National South. And Oakland has the 1-game lead over Phoenix and Hawaii in the National West. Pittsburgh now has a half-game lead over Baltimore in the Century East. Chicago has like a half-a-game lead over Oklahoma in the Century Central. Miami has a half-game lead over Dallas in the Century South. And San Francisco has a tiebreaker over El Paso in the Century West. So how about this major turnaround so far for the week, as now just Cleveland and Jacksonville remain the last 2 undefeated teams. Now they play each other later on this year, so someone's going to lose eventually, so who knows what will happen with that one, as Milwaukee still remains winless. Now we go take a look at the National Conference playoff bracket, as Jacksonville and Cleveland still have the byes, with Manhattan going to Omaha and Birmingham going to Oakland still, as everyone else still fighting hard for a playoff spot, as Milwaukee is dead last in the conference at 0-9, as we're getting closer and closer to start talking about playoff elimination clinching scenario. And then we go over to the Century Conference, as it's Chicago and Miami with the byes, with Dallas going to San Francisco and Oklahoma now going to Pittsburgh, as we have 4 teams with over a 500 record still fighting for a playoff spot, and with 5 of the teams having a 500 or better record at the moment. This division is this conference is very competitive, with New Orleans being last in the division now at 1-7. Hard to believe since they were the 3rd seed the year before. So now we take a look at the Week 10 schedule, as we'll get things started with Indianapolis going to Atlanta. That's important. San Antonio going to Baltimore. Jacksonville going to Cincinnati. That could be interesting. Manhattan going to Cleveland. That's going to be important, as the National East on the line, as Manhattan's like the last opponent that Cleveland has left to take on. Orlando going to Columbus. Oakland going to Detroit. That's a matchup between 2 teams that terrible last year. Right now have winning records, so that's going to be very interesting. San Francisco going to Kansas City. Another important game between those 2 teams, as they need to keep up in their divisions. Denver going to Milwaukee. Buffalo going to Minneapolis, and Chicago going to Oklahoma. That's going to be a big showdown in the Century Central, as we go over to the 4 p.m. games with an important Century West game, as Seattle goes to El Paso, then Philadelphia goes to Las Vegas, Portland goes to Los Angeles, Miami goes to Phoenix, Birmingham goes to Pittsburgh. That's going to be a defensive struggle. New Orleans goes to San Diego, and Louisville goes to Tampa. That'll be interesting to see. And we get to our Sunday night game with Houston going to Dallas, and then the Monday night showdown with Washington going to Boston. And with that, Week 9 of the 2017 PFA season is in the books. I can't wait for Week 10, hopefully soon. So see you guys then for next week.